I'd like to welcome everyone to today's discussion. My name is Susan Elliott. I am the NCAFP President and CEO. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you participating today for your generosity and support of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's important work. Today's program is very special because we are going to highlight the fantastic accomplishments of two very outstanding women. We look forward, and I hope as all of you will, to our gala celebration on November 10th, when we will present the George F. Kinnan Award for Distinguished Public Service to Admiral Michelle Howard and the 21st Century Leader Award to Lauren Buitta. You know, since our celebrations are virtual, we wanted everyone who supports us to have an opportunity to get to know our distinguished honorees. And so we decided that we would host this pre-gala event. And then, as you know, we will have a post-gala event with our other honoree, Sean Kelly, later in the month. But we're very pleased today also to have Jacqueline Adams with us again this year to moderate not only today's discussion, but to moderate the discussion of our awards ceremony. So now I have the really high honor of introducing our distinguished panel to you. I'll first start with Admiral Howard, who's a retired United States Navy officer. She began serving in the United States Navy in 1982 after graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy. And I have to say, I hope, Admiral Howard, you don't mind that I say this, but she didn't just break the glass ceiling in the U.S. Navy. In my opinion, she smashed it. She was the first African-American woman to command a ship in the United States Navy. She was the first woman to become a four-star admiral in the United States Navy. She also was the first woman and first African-American to be appointed to the position of Vice Chief of Naval Operations, which is the second highest ranking uniformed officer in the branch, and I believe the first woman to ever hold that position. She also served as the commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe and U.S. Naval Forces Africa, as well as the commander of Allied Joint Force Command Naples, which is a NATO allied command force. This is where I first met Admiral Howard, and I have to tell you, she impressed me from day one. As a woman, myself sitting around the table with a lot of other very high-ranking military officers, I was really impressed by Admiral Howard's ability to hold her own and really be a strong and outstanding leader. And her distinguished career in national defense has included both at sea and ashore posts, and her key leadership positions within the areas of engineering, operations, strategic planning, and policy are all things that I'm sure we may dabble a little bit into today. Our second honoree is Lauren Buitta. And Lauren also has a very distinguished career. She's the founder and CEO of Girl Security. Lauren began her career in national security in Chicago, Illinois, and in 2003 as a policy analyst with the National Security Forum, a nonpartisan security think tank, she worked. And in 2016, she was recognized for both her she recognized both the continued underrepresentation of women in national security and the need for a more intersectional approach in security. In response, she formed Girl Security, the only organization dedicated to advancing girls, women, and gender minorities in national security through supportive pathways. So we're really pleased to have you with us, Lauren, today. And finally, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Jacqueline Adams. Again, Jackie has had a very distinguished career. In fact, she's in her second career now as a communication strategist, but she spent more than 2 decades as an Emmy Award-winning CBS News correspondent. Jackie, as I know from the time that I've known her, is a real connector, and she has a unique ability to hear clients' strategic concerns and find creative solutions, drawing upon her wealth of contacts and experiences in media, business, academic, and civic circles. And that's why she's the perfect person, you know, to moderate our discussion today. I also want to mention that in 2020, she co-authored a book, A Blessing, Women of Color Teaming Up to Lead, Empower, and Thrive. And she also launched a bi-monthly column, #TeamUp, in the Christian Science Monitor. So Anyway, I'm really pleased to have all of you today. And I would just tell you, if we're going to have a discussion, Jackie will go over how she'll run the dialogue, but just for you to know, we are recording this. It's on the record. And if you have a question, I recommend that you type it into the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you, that would be the easiest way for us to connect to hear your questions. So I want to turn the program over now to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Susan, for those very generous introductions. It is my great pleasure to be back with you again and the National Committee on American Foreign Policy audience. Let me add my congratulations to your gala honorees this year, the George F. Kennan Award for Distinguished Public Service to Admiral Michelle Howard, and the 21st Century Leader Award to Lauren Buitta, the founder and CEO of Girl Security. As Susan noted, here are just a few notes about our plan for this morning. Admiral Howard, Lauren, and I will be chatting for a little more than an hour, and at 12:10, we will begin taking questions from those of you in our audience. We'll take your questions for about 15 minutes, and if you could put them in the chat box, we'll keep an eye on the subjects that are of interest to you. Admiral Howard, let's start with you. It's lovely to see you again. We met in person before the pandemic began, and I've been reading about just how busy you've been with your ongoing public service. You and I are part of the United States Institute of Peace Women's Peacebuilding Awards selection process. And just last week, I think it was, we named a second recipient of this award, Josephine Akiru, who is a conservation activist in Kenya. Last fall, you participated in the Biden transition team at the Pentagon, and now you're in the middle of deciding which military bases to rename. It doesn't sound as if you're exactly resting on your laurels. How is your retirement, so-called, going?
Well, I would have an opinion. I would tell you my husband would give me a D-. So, I truly plan to just back away and spend more time with my family. I'm from Colorado. My mother's here and my siblings are here. And my husband loved this part of the country. So I'm in Colorado in a small town of 51 people. And I thought, maybe if I was far away from the Beltway, I could live, start my new life. But the world is incredibly connected, and there's been some requests where I just thought I just can't say no. And there's been some opportunities. So not just U.S. Institute of Peace, I'm also on the Defense Military Advisory Group. But I started off as a visiting professor at George Washington University for 2 years, and that gave me a chance to create a course on cyber and policy in the context of international relations. And I thought that was something that was really needed. And it turned out to be beneficial to me to get to work with undergrads and graduates and hear about what the next generation is thinking about.
Well, thank you so much for your ongoing service, and your participation today is part of that. Let's take a few steps back for both of you, Admiral and Lauren. Can you tell me at what age and stage national security became known to you as a career option? Admiral, do you want to begin, and then we'll go to Lauren?
Well, actually, I was pretty young. I saw a documentary on television, and it was about the Air Force Academy, I believe, and I was just fascinated by the folks in uniform, the leadership opportunities, the teamwork. And I was 12 and went to my older brother and was like, I want to go to the Air Force Academy. I want to go to a service academy. And he just, he hit me with the truth. You can't, they're closed to women. It was the law. And so I was shocked. I go to my mom and she's like, no, he's telling you the truth. And she said, but you're only 12, you could change your mind. And, but she said, if you don't, I would encourage you when you're old enough to apply. And then she said, if you're rejected because you're a woman, we'll sue the government. And so mom was in my corner. I didn't change my mind, and the law changed in 76 when I was 16. I applied when I was 17, and I started the Naval Academy in 78.
Great. Lauren?
That's unbelievable. I love your mom.
I love her
Yeah, I can imagine. My mom was very similar. I don't think I knew that national security was necessarily a career until 9/11. I was a junior in college. I studied political science and I was really interested in topics like international organized crime and things of that nature. But I didn't think national security was a career. I was kind of told from a young age that I would be a lawyer. And so I think I went into school thinking I'm going to study political science and then go into law. And after I graduated, I returned back to Chicago and I was actually working at a law firm and I was miserable. And I started looking for jobs in international affairs and foreign policy. And I skipped out on my law firm job and went and interviewed at this think tank, the one that was noted. And I still didn't know what national security was. And it took a while for me to understand that it was this kind of very distinct area, within the broader context of politics and law and policy. And I learned fast on the job as a result of that.
Having read about your backgrounds and having heard you both speak a bit, the issue of national security is really quite personal for both of you. Admiral, you describe yourself as a warrior. And I think many of us have a sort of romantic notion about the military from movies and books. Can you tell us a bit more about your definition, the role of a warrior in international policy as well as domestic policy?
Well, for me, it's the extreme ends of the spectrum of capability and response. I mean, when the world is set up, you either can have cooperation, competition, or conflict. And in pursuit of national security interests, particularly those vital interests, that's when the nation says, okay, this is so important to us, we're willing to die for it. Or whether or not it's important to us, it's a vital interest, and we will cease to exist as a nation, as a democracy, if we're not willing to fight for this. And so the real issue is this, I think, cultural perspective that goes across many countries, that women are not warriors, women are victims in war. And that's proven out. And when you look across the different studies of wars, the most likely people to be victims and casualties are women and children, disproportionately to the warriors who are actually fighting. And so with this country, the history of women in war fighting goes back to our roots, the Revolutionary War. There have always been women who volunteered and served with combatant units, and not necessarily as the nurses, but literally being willing to help move ammo or to pick up a weapon. And that goes through the Civil War, but it's not until the 20th century that we see our defense starting to literally integrate women formally into the military. And then it's not until after World War II, despite the full range of activities women did, that Congress allows for women to serve on active duty. And then for the modern day military, it's not till 93, 94 with the combat exclusion law that you see women in what the Army would call combat arms. But at that point, we've completely shifted. Desert Storm showed us women can be on the battlefield. If they're in a support role, you're still in conflict, you're still in combat, you're just doing a different job. And so if you're still in combat, then you might as well be allowed to do the full range of mission, whether it's fighter pilot, or in my case, surface warfare at sea.
Lauren, you've noted that you've had experiences in the construction industry and that women in that industry were excluded by design. You've also noted that in a national security context, you felt personally unsafe, personally compromised. Can you link those two experiences, gender exclusion and personal safety, in this national security context?
Yeah, I worked, my dad put me on as a construction worker in Chicago during summers in college to help pay for school. And it was an interesting experience, to be in my 18, 19 years old. I probably weighed about 100 pounds and was the only woman on every construction site. And And what was so fascinating by contrast when I started my career in national security is I'd spent several years on job sites and for the most part was treated with a certain level of respect, probably because they thought I was crazy for what I was doing. But I think as a young person coming into the national security space and specifically the policy space, it's surprising when someone says something or does something in a professional context in which you don't expect it. And it can be very disarming. And so for me, you know, when I talk about girl security, I'm pretty candid about the fact that I'm sort of the moral of the story, which was I had a series of very bad experiences, a boss who behaved very inappropriately and it set my career off track for a while. But in fact, what ended up happening was I left the position I had to leave the position for my own safety. And I ended up working on civil rights and racially exclusionary land use policies in the city of Chicago for about 10 years. And had I not had those experiences, I think there's a lot of elements of girl security's model that would not have been integrated. And so I often say that, you know, national security is very personal to me, both because my brother was deployed to Iraq and I kind of saw the impact that that had on my mother specifically and my family and him, you know, upon return. But also, you know, there's kind of this intersectionality of not just intersectionality in terms of, you know, the broader issues of what defines national security, but girls and women who have an interest in security pathways at minimum should feel safe and valued as they advance into those spaces, whether they're warriors or war fighters, or they're prospective national security lawyers as I was, or they want to work in the policy space. There should be no structural barriers to their advancement. And so I think, as you know, in our work with girl security, it's building up that sense of personal security, that they have the skills that they need to advance, but also trying to lead a conversation at the higher levels and specifically around the military, where we hear from a lot of young women in our program that they've already had adverse interactions. They've already been sexually harassed or assaulted at 19, 20 years old. How do we have that conversation so that they're not exiting the field before they even enter the field? And that's not unique to the military, and it happens across all sectors and national security.
Let's talk a little bit more about what girl security is and how you operate. I went to your website and noted that according to recent studies, women make up less than 40% of the US State Department's leadership and 26% at the Pentagon. In the private sector, women comprise 24% of the cybersecurity workforce and just 21% of the supply chain management workforce. Let's both of us talk, the three of us talk a bit more about why there have been, in fact, so few women in the national security infrastructure, and the types of careers that in which gender should not matter at all.
I can start, Admiral, if I could just talk a bit about girl security. I think there's a couple of complex dimensions to this discussion, which is there's norms, as the Admiral noted, that send a message that girls and women don't belong in active security spaces. And we just saw this with the National Commission. They just did a whole survey on public service and whether or not women should be drafted. And many people hold the opinion that women are life makers, not life takers. I think that actually was one of the quotes from the report. So I think broadly in the national security domain, there's a 100-year history of modern national security that really has pigeonholed women as kind of pacifists or peacemakers, which they may be, but it's others setting the norms for what women can be or should be in a particular space like national security, which is the most powerful political realm in the world. I mean, every decision that the United States makes can change the course of history. So there's that element in our opinion at girl security. But then there's also just the lack of knowledge of pathways. You know, so we work with high schools across the country, and we focus specifically on underserved communities. It started in Chicago. And national security careers, whether cyber or otherwise, maybe with the military, with the exception, are just not pathways that, you know, career counselors necessarily know about, which is no fault of their own. A lot of kids that we work with, a lot of girls from the programs that we work with, they're still thinking of those traditional pathways, you know, doctor, lawyer, architect, whatever it may be. And it's just a lack of awareness. And I would just say lastly is there's structural barriers in place, whether it's education and equity at the front end. There's a lack of opportunity that's available early on in girls and women's pathways. There's some of the elements around safety and security that we've talked to. And then I think at the higher levels, watching women advance through national security pathways, particularly if they're in an active security role, can be challenging in trying to balance some of those elements of family and work. So it's a pretty complex picture as to why I think the numbers haven't significantly increased over the last 25 years. But I feel hopeful in the sense that I think there's a lot more attention being paid to the value of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in national security.
Admiral, you stayed in the military and you obviously climbed the ranks successfully, despite the lack of role models that you had to observe.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously, since I was the first, there was no one who looked like me ahead of me. But let me just, if I could go back to the original question. So the fact you put out was, leadership at the Pentagon, but we need to think about the career path, and then let's just set aside the civilian leadership. But when you're talking about the military, we don't hire sideways, right? Vacancy opens up, oh, we need a general officer, we'll just hire one. Doesn't work that way. So for all of the services, it requires literally decades of reinforcing experience at command at the tactical level, the operational level, before you're even probably have enough skills to even be considered to become a one-star. And so I put it this way, look, in the military, it takes generally a quarter of a century to create a candidate to become a one-star. And so then when you're talking beyond that, you're talking about it's the individual's commitment, because remember, we're all volunteers, and their willingness to stay and continue to do mission. So then when you say, well, it takes that long. So when you look at when I started, the Navy was probably 5-7% women. So when you look at the originating pool, you've got to realize, hey, there's only 20% women admirals today. Well, that's because that was probably the percentage of women that existed 25 years ago. And so as the percentages of women increase, then and as long as they retain at the same ratios as the men do, then within the military, because they're generally meritocracies, you're going to see more and more women leaders. The other underpinning of this, Lauren's area, it's the law, right? So the combat exclusion law wasn't repealed for women in the aviation and women in combatant ships until 93 and 94. So the opportunity to grow up to be a 1, 2, or 3-star didn't really, the playing field wasn't leveled till the 90s. And then for the land components, by policy, women were barred from direct ground combat. Well, that's been only a few years. And so the opportunity to serve in the main mission of the Marines and the Army has only been recent. That said, there have been, when you look from General Dunwoody's promotion as the first woman 4-star, there have now been a number of women 4-stars, not just me, but, we're on our General Robinson is the first woman combatant commander. We've got our second woman combatant commander at Southcom, a number of women 4-stars across the services. So I at 3 and 4 stars. So what we're seeing in terms of the military side is just the reality of how long it takes to grow leadership. It would be a story if after the law was changed, there weren't any women 3 and 4 stars. That's when there's problems with the system. But probably when you look at the numbers that there are and what the numbers were when those women started, that's actually a pretty good success story. Harder to explain then is the civilian side, where it's political appointments. We're on our 3rd woman Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the first one was only within the last decade. And then when you look at how in many ways for national security, there has to be an increasing level of positions and skill sets. I think when you look at the military side and the leadership, there's generally a better ratio of women senior leaders, than even what we're seeing on the civilian side in leadership. And so how do you create someone like a Kathleen Hicks or a Michelle Flournoy? We've got to get them in at those starter jobs, whether it's at State Department or Defense, and let them grow up to be the head of policy, let them grow up to be DepSecDef. So eventually they have the background to be the quality candidate to be the Secretary of Defense. That's where we need, I think, the mentoring and better structure, so civilians, women particularly, have a chance to grow up to be the leader.
Let's dig down a little bit deeper into those pathways. It's interesting to hear you compare and contrast the civilian side of national security versus what's actually going on in the military. Again, from the Girl Security website, we see that girls are on the front lines of pressing national security challenges with gendered impact, including disinformation, artificial intelligence, climate change, and national security pathways remain inaccessible to girls, particularly those from under-resourced communities. So as we look at the history, we look at the laws that have been changed, what could and should be done to open up more pathways for girls and women to finally get closer to parity in these fields?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is, when I first started this many years ago, and I knew this at the time because kind of the partisan nature of national security can't be avoided. When you're talking about these big conversations around wars and things like that, the country can be divided. And so I think there is a component, which is that national security, even though it should be the most nonpartisan issue, is actually quite partisan. So there's an element of that out there in the world, orbiting in communities outside of Washington, D.C. And I can speak to that from working with those communities and being from a community like that myself in Illinois. But I think it's mostly a lack of knowledge and a lack of support. And so where we try to situate ourselves is really working at the community level to first introduce girls into the national security dialogue. Let's talk about what this means to you. Let's talk about what your exposure level is, to develop a baseline understanding of how much they even know about national security. I mean, we're having this big conversation about lack of civic education and so forth. There's a lot of lack of understanding of just basic government. And so some of what we end up doing is working with girls at the community level and just explaining basic government and how this works, and then injecting national security as a component of that. But really, I think it's exposure to pathways. What do pathways look like? Providing learning and training. So we offer a 6-month stipended apprentice program where girls and women learn from experts from across national security pathways and do different types of skill building. And then I think mentoring is also a big part of it, which we do. We have a really strong mentor network of, over 1,000 mentors. We have 800 mentees. So building this kind of ecosystem of support so that as girls and women advance through the mentorship network, they then become mentors themselves. And it creates this kind of sustained effect of, again, to Admiral Howard's point of ensuring that if they want to be in these pathways, that they can stay in and feel supported in those pathways. But I think specifically for communities of color or communities that we work with who may have had a negative experience with law enforcement, let's say vis-a-vis ICE, we have young women in our program whose parents we're afraid of being detained. And these are the same girls and young women who now want to go in and reform the immigration system. So there is this need to have what we call like a trauma-informed or equity-informed approach, where we have a conversation about identity and national security as a means of getting girls and women in the conversation. And validating the fact that they have a stake in the national security conversation, even if they don't pursue pathways, just civically understanding what national security looks like and how their voice can be activated, I think can be a very powerful, untapped resource in this space as well.
You make me think about Black communities and the police and the talk that parents have with young men, and should there in fact be a talk with young women as well?
I think there should be, because we know from the data, especially around the pandemic, that especially girls of color are experiencing highest rates, suicide rates, a lot of trauma. And I think when we're talking about national security, it feels like this abstract concept, but with DHS or FBI, these are very local and visible forces or people in a lot of communities. And so I think there is value in having a healthy conversation about what that looks like and what those different power dynamics look like. And as I said, we have a lot of girls in our program from very diverse backgrounds who want to step into these spaces and want to either make a change or be part of this kind of purpose-driven field. But we feel very strongly that we have to talk about identity in our work, because if we don't, then it feels unethical. We have to have this conversation at the front end so that it can be a conversation that they continue to have as they move throughout their pathways as well.
It's interesting also to sort of look at the arc of history. I can remember a joke from about 10 years ago, and it was a little boy asking, can a man become Secretary of State? And that was because he saw Madeleine Albright from 1997 to 2001, and Condoleezza Rice from 2005 to 2009, and then Hillary Clinton from 2009 to 2013. Has the memory of that era been forgotten in just a decade, or were those three women anomalies? Admiral, do you have a point of view?
Well, I think it's probably, so my master's degree is in history. It's probably too short a time frame to try and make correlations. And in reality, if you just say broaden it, okay, over that certain time frame, half the secretaries were men and half the secretaries were women. So that kind of reflects the population. So probably what we need to consider is that it's the period before Madeleine Albright, right? And that Madeleine Albright reflects that inflection point, just as Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court is that inflection point. And that and it's not going to be, there's always going to be a woman Secretary of State, just as there's, always got to be a woman treasurer. As long as we see over time that there are consistently women candidates put forth and sometimes women candidates selected as cabinet members. It's if you get to a really, really long period where it's like, oh, there's just never any women and they never break through. But it's not going to be, it's always going to be a woman or it's always going to be a man. I think the context and time frame is too short to make a correlation.
I think I shared with both of you a recent foreign policy article that I saw that lamented the lack of female participation in peacemaking. And the author quoted a 2018 World Economic Forum finding only 4% of signatories to peace agreements between 1992 and 2011 were women, and only 9% of the negotiators. Yet studies have shown that female participation is the secret to ensuring lasting peace. And the report cites examples of women being instrumental to forging peace in Liberia, Northern Ireland, and the Philippines. And foreign policy continues, according to UN Women, when women participate in a peace process, it increases the likelihood of peace lasting more than 2 years by 20%. The UN Security Council has called for women to be more involved in conflict resolution. Talk to me a bit about how we can do more to increase the participation of women in peacemaking beyond just having a conversation about it in forums like this.
Admiral Howard, I feel like you would have a good answer on this one. I can add something.
There's a couple of different aspects to that. So the stats you're talking about are over a pretty lengthy time, and that there's a difference, I think, before the 1325 resolution and after the 1325 resolution, and you actually do see when you're talking about the 9%, that's more recent, right? you look before 1325, it was probably close to 0% in terms of women being involved in peace negotiation. So if you separate it out from the actual peacekeepers and peacemakers, the challenge on that side is there's been many a country that's come up with a lofty goal in terms of the, it has to be the peacekeepers themselves generally come from a military background or a law enforcement background. And so once again, it's, you know, it's great when a country like Nigeria says, hey, we're going to make sure 20% of our peacekeepers, as we go about and do Amazon business, UN business, are women. Well, is 20% of your military women? And is that 20% in the combat arms? No. And so you can create a lofty goal, but when you look across the, even just looking just at NATO, when you look across the militaries that are the member nations of NATO, and people will throw stones at the US, but we have one of the highest percentages of women in the military. So who exceeds us? Countries like Norway, but their army is only a couple thousand people. So, okay, we can generate in a year maybe 200 women, but that means we're pulling them out of their primary jobs and sending them off to doing peacekeeping. So until there's equality within all of the militaries that provide peacekeepers, you're not going to be able to get that cohort that you want to increase. And so so you really have to back up and say, this is really about equality and how we view women. And this gets back to, do we view women as warriors? Because if you don't view them as a warrior and someone competent at arms, then you're not going to view them as competent as being a peacekeeper, because in the end, you're there to ensure peace, but you're armed. You're the security force to protect those civilians or to keep two opposing forces apart. On the civilian side, it has to be an active, and I think every country has to commit that if they are going to provide civilian leaderships to the peace negotiations, then it's the countries themselves in that leadership that say, we're going to seek out the natural leaders, you know, the women, and make sure the women have a voice in the process. Because it's generally the civilian leadership in charge of those peacekeeping forces that are creating the framework and determining who the leaders are who are coming to the table. And it's that training of that civilian leadership and making sure they're inclusive to, in some communities where women are more isolated, they have thoughts and they have ideas that are actually pretty helpful to the process, but making sure that they can help break through those barriers and bring those women to the table.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, I always, I think this is an unpopular opinion, but I struggle with the word peace. I think about women I've worked with across different communities, and I don't really know what peace looks like for some of them. And I wonder sometimes if we re-envision these concepts to be more reflective of the experiences of women, that maybe we might have at least some better messaging to lead with. And I know that sounds very abstract, but I think we're at this inflection point, even with the context of women, peace, and security, of these concepts are siloed, and those siloed words have implications. And I think even, you know, to kind of flip what Admiral Howard said, is even just perception of women as warriors, but also perception of what militaries actually do. And I do think of my brother who worked with women in northern Iraq, and he was serving very much in a civilian supportive capacity. And so I think we really need to dispel a lot of myths around both what military provides in terms of services, the role of women in the military and what those roles look like. And then I think at Girl Security, you know, we really try to speak very little to girls and women about what we think. We try to ask them, what does security mean to you? What does that feel like when you feel secure? And I think what we're seeing with local law enforcement, to kind of bring it to the domestic side, is that Chicago just started implementing, you know, sending social workers and mental health counselors for certain emergency response situations. I think generally speaking, this goes across the board as military and conflict, as well as I think we're at this point where we're just rethinking the nuances around complex security situations, and not just what role do women have, but what different types of roles might all people have in responding to these different scenarios. And so I think there's still a lot of myths to dispel around these areas, despite the fact that, you know, we kind of know what the military does, but we don't. And then I think the other part is just some of the ways in which, you know, we're at this kind of divisive moment in our country where the military, you know, the military is kind of being put in this divisive spotlight as with respect to what its role is in this democracy. And I hope that doesn't hurt young people's prospects into service. But I think at Girl Security, we're following that dialogue very closely and working with the girls who are already on the tracks to service, just to understand what their experience is in service within the context of where we are as a nation as well.
So Jackie, if I could have one more follow-up on that. So when you're trying to change how we view security, so Lauren said, I don't know what peace is. So for the military, when we go into an area, then it's really, if we're just trying to get to stability and security, which for most human beings means it's peace, right? I could go about my daily lives without a threat of being harmed. Then where we have to translate that for militaries across the globe is an understanding. It is, if we can get to, it's the condition of women that determines whether or not you have security or stability in almost every country. So if you get to the metrics of the woman feels safe going to the well, you know, even after dark to draw water, and the women are gathering around the well, that is you've achieved stability and security. Children get to go to school. The women feel comfortable walking their children to school. The markets open up. Women feel comfortable doing the shopping. And I know, oh my gosh, these are stereotype roles of women. Well, in a lot of the places where we fight, that is, they are the heart of the family, and they are the primary caregivers. And so when women can go about their daily lives and you have all the metrics, that's when you achieve stability, and that's when you achieve security. And forget any other metric you want. But if we put peace building, peacekeeping through that lens, then I think we could get farther along in terms of getting to the peace that Lauren's talking about.
Thanks so much for presenting that concrete picture of what peace looks like. And you sort of put it in a rural context, but there are certainly parallels in cities that reflect that same image that you created. Just because it's personal to both you and me, Admiral, the U.S. Institute of Peace's decision to present this annual award to women peace builders, is that a major step forward? Is that helpful? And I think when I've been reading the descriptions of the different nominees, should we not try to get more of that information out there to describe the actual work on the ground, the actual histories of these women, the actual personal challenges that they have had and have overcome in order to even be nominated for a Peace Builder Award?
No, Jackie, you're absolutely right. To Lauren's point, this is about exposure. You are not going to think about a career in a particular community if you've never heard about it and you don't understand that people who look like you are already in that community, already doing work. And they not only are already doing work, but they've been successful. And so when you look at the award, that's just one more way to expose the fact that there are women peacekeepers, women leaders, to be frank, is what I call them, who are successful, who've made a difference for their community and their country, and sometimes for our continent. And so there has to be that exposure. And so if we don't learn about government as much as we need to, as Lauren pointed out, and civics, then when we look at how and what we teach, you know, and the average textbook, and whether it's through the lens of people of color exist or women exist, that that crucible of public education, that's where a lot of this needs to start.
Maybe we need to push to get USIP to put the nominations of all of the finalists on the website, or to celebrate them to a greater degree in the ceremony, because that material has been quite eye-opening to me, but we are reading it sort of in private, in confidentiality. It's not out in the public.
Well, please let us know, because we're happy to also push that out to, you know, a group of 14 to 19-year-olds, which might not, which would be a really great thing for them to see as well.
Again, this is also such heavy material, and just to increase the ability for the message to be heard, I just wanted to lighten things just a tiny bit. And I just rewatched the Ruth Bader Ginsburg documentary. And she was the first to say, and I was struck by this quote, "I ask no favor from my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks." I mean, isn't that the crux of the inequity that we're talking about, the danger that we're talking about? Brethren's feet on our neck?
Yeah, that's it's when I saw that question, I was you know, we're coming off of the you know, revisiting the suffrage movement, and one of the things that gives me hope, because I spend so much time with young people in our work, is they're coming to these historical places with so much more information than I think any generation before. And I love that quote, which is a quote from a poem by Sarah Grimke. And it was, you know, really reflecting the struggle of suffragists at the time to make their voices heard, to be more active participants civically. And yet women of color and women globally were forging this different type of fight, you know, for recognition, for civic engagement. And so I think, in a sense, that we're still having that same conversation, and different communities are having different versions of that same conversation. But to kind of light, I guess, put a positive spin, I can go dark. I spend a lot of time going dark in conversations, but it's a running joke in my family. But I do think that young people are coming to these places with information and awareness and a sense of cohesion, or at least a willingness to learn from each other in a way that prior generations were not. And I think as a result of that, I feel particularly optimistic about where we are, when I know lots of folks don't, because I do believe that they're kind of seeding these new ideals that will shape movements 10, 20 years from now, that will take us further ahead than where we are.
A lot of the research that we did for my book points to a concept that we've called generational diversity. Young people are more confident than perhaps we were about the future. They are not going to just sit back and take conditions that we just accepted as norms. So sometimes breaking norms, particularly among the young, is going to lead us forward. They give, my young friends give me tremendous hope. Let's shift gears just a little bit to talk about diversity and economic benefits, economic results, and and business performance. McKinsey has done a lot of research in this area, and they point to 30-odd% increases in corporate performance when teams are diverse, both by gender and by race. Do you see, is there enough data to see similarities in the national security context? And I guess really it's the impact of diverse viewpoints in decision-making in a strategic context.
For the military, I think we're the recipients and blessed by years of recruiting. So in terms of our enlisted force, we're incredibly, across all the services, incredibly diverse and reflective of small towns, cities, and you know, every community that exists, whatever slice you want to take, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender. And so the diversity of perspective is now baked in to the military. Where we are less diverse is at the officer level, but that keeps slowly changing and becoming more reflective of the country that we're in. And then I would say on the civilian side, it's not that the candidates are there, it's a choice, right? To particularly, I think when you look at less formal employment, I want to go be a foreign service officer, but when you look at the thought leadership that gets created when you're creating a cabinet or creating the various departments below the cabinets, the talent is there. So it's a matter of choice of saying, I'm going to look at a candidate pool that's as diverse as America, and not just look at the candidate pool of folks I feel good about and worked with. And I think once you expand the candidate pool, then you get to that diversity, and then you get to all the pieces McKinsey and Harvard Business School have all talked about, that when you have those diverse perspectives, the teams tend to be more innovative, more responsive in business, more responsive to customers, and they're more collaborative as teams.
And I was just going to add, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add those, it's, to me, sometimes these arguments, they're the need to incentivize, right, through some type of economic model is problematic because it kind of skips the problem to the kind of metrics place. And I think at least what we're trying to do is flip that script a little bit and say, but why do we have to quantify the value of diversity? Let's take a look at some of these structural barriers, because those are really easy to quantify. It's easy to understand education inequity. It's easy to understand data around, economic mobility of underserved communities or girls of women in particular pathways. And so, at least with the work that we do, it's how do you measure security? How do you measure success in national security or measure growth in national security outside of kind of DEI with some of those bottom line metrics? And then once you do that, how do you back that out and connect that data to, okay, so what do we need to do to increase that diversity to yield more of those outcomes? And I think we should be starting with that first part, right? Which is, why is there an underrepresentation? And I think in national security, because it has this history of being this, pretty selective elite community of people, specifically around political appointments and the like, that conversation has never happened. Education inequity, there's a direct causal line between underrepresentation and parts of national security, especially where only certain colleges or universities has access to fellowships or internships or, opportunities to study particular subject matter. There's elements of with the intelligence community around security clearance. That's a big issue why there's a lack of diversity in the IC is, certain behaviors or criminal behaviors that, maybe even society's changed the lens on are reasons why people can't progress into the intelligence community. So I think the metrics are good, but I think we kind of need to back it out and take a look at why we need to quantify those things as well.
Well, the argument's always that you only actually proceed with activities that you can measure.
Yeah.
And
I don't like that.
And that's why you're the leader of an organization and are being honored today, in the 21st century, I guess. I wanted to speak personally a little bit just for a minute, because when I was in high school and college, I thought I had pretty good guidance counselors, and but nowhere did I hear anything about foreign policy or the foreign service. And I didn't discover the foreign service really until I was a reporter covering the US hostages in Iraq in 1978 and 79 and 80. And if I had known about that career earlier, I might have chosen it. We've hinted at it, but talk a little bit more specifically about the pathways to a career in in advocacy, in cyber, in policy, the role of or the importance of the STEM subjects in pursuing these careers. Are changes being made at these early years, high school years, to a great enough degree, or not? You're so much closer, Lauren, to the young people who are beginning their careers.
It's, I mean, I just want to first say, I hope I didn't imply that there's any fault on behalf of schools. I think career counselors, social workers, teachers, they have so many requirements put upon them that I don't think they even have time to breathe, and especially now with the pandemic. So I think that's where STEM education is. We've invested a lot of money in STEM, but unfortunately, at the end of the day, teaching, educating students with STEM, there's trade-offs, right? So young people aren't developing as high of literacy rates or things like that. And there's a lot of data out there for that. I think one of the things that girl security, I don't think we get pushback on necessarily, but I think we're still trying to make the case that we need to be engaging young people sooner. It's a privilege to go to college. You know, I'm a first generation college grad. It was a privilege to go to college, and many young people won't have that opportunity. So aside from waiting for the education system to be disrupted, we need to be reaching especially girls and populations of color sooner in high school, who may not have the privilege of go to school, but if they do, they're at that point where they're actualizing their professional pathways. They're thinking about those pathways then. And at least with all the STEM studies, we know that girls' kind of self-confidence in STEM peaks at middle school and then drops off significantly in high school. So the fact that there isn't more being done to activate that high school network and provide those pathways sooner is something that we feel very strongly needs to be put in place. And again, there's some movement and there are some awesome programs out there, but that's also why we start our fellowship at the high school level. I think with a space like cybersecurity specifically, there's a lot of gatekeeping, you know, the cost of certifications, the cost of professional trainings, you know, some of the hiring practices. There's a lot of also excellent work being done in that space. But at the end of the day, I believe oftentimes that the adults tell young people, this is what we need. We need STEM, we need cyber, we need AI, we need all these things. But when you sit with kids and you ask what those things mean to them, they have no idea. Not only that, they don't want to be told what to do. And so I think if we had more models around bringing kids into more open spaces and having more of a discourse-driven pathways approach, we might find that the metrics might take longer, but the metrics would be yielded by different types of approaches that respond to their needs. And then I think just one other element is, you know, the rates or the percentages of young people, and specifically girls, diagnosed with things like ADHD, dyslexia, and so forth, continue to increase. I think I can't remember the latest statistic, but it's pretty significant. And so we're just going to be needing to change entirely how we educate and engage young people across communities if we really want to grow the type of diversity I think that we all hope and strive for.
I remember never having a choice about college. I was going. The idea of not going never crossed my mind. And Admiral, it sounds like from a very early age, you knew that you were going on to an advanced level of education too.
Well, I wanted to go to a service academy, but no. My dad was the Air Force Master Sergeant who had quit school at 13 to shine shoes to help feed the rest of his family. His one expression was checkout time is 18. So there was, and he got his bachelor's degree on the GI Bill, literally 6 months before I graduated from Annapolis. So he's the first one in my family to get a bachelor's degree, and that includes all his siblings. And then I was the second. And so my siblings, 4 of us, 3, my brother and sister got theirs working full time and going to college. So they were in their 20s and 30s when they got their degrees. My mother just kept going to school. She got her bachelor's at 65. So it's not that education isn't important, but to Lauren's point, it's a privilege. And you know, the daughter of a master sergeant, unless you were going to get a lot of scholarships, There was not going to be the money. I remember in high school, it was a conversation with my parents as to whether or not we could afford for me to take the SAT.
Mhm.
So there's a economic line that's pretty highly linked to the color line in this country. And so literally, if we just decided to phrase it this way, we're going to go after economic diversity, we would get to all the other diversity we're talking about in this country.
I think that's, I really can't, I'm just, my head is just saying yes. And I think sometimes it surprises people to hear, you know, we were in a school district over the summer in Chicago doing a cybersecurity training. You know, there's thousands of kids in this district. They don't have one computer science course. They're not talking about STEM. They're not talking about any of these subjects, yet every kid has a phone and they know how to use it. And so I think there's this other element of, you know, yes, STEM is critical. We know that STEM is going to be core to the future of our technology challenges. But again, we're the economic kind of, the economic divide, the ways in which we're approaching empowering kids, particularly kids who lack access in tech, in STEM, is just not lining up with what they need. And so I think there's just a lot left to be done to have some innovative approaches to reaching more kids with pathways in STEM and government and cyber and really every other pathway. There's more we need to be doing.
Talk to me a little bit more, Lauren, about the role of mentoring. I think earlier you said your organization has 1,000 mentors and 800 mentees. How does that mentoring work? And I know some people, friends of mine anyway, sort of poo-poo the whole notion of mentoring. How early can it start? How long lasting does a relationship, a mentoring relationship, have to last to create a national security career?
It's funny, when I thought mentor was such a pretentious word when I was young until I had a mentor and I realized how important it was. And for us, it's a 6-month commitment. A mentor spends 6 months mentoring a girl, woman, or female identifying participant in our program. And it can start as early as 16. And they're essentially a safe sounding board. That's how our mentorship program works. The mentors provide a safe space to ask hard questions that you might not want to ask of someone in your academic sphere or perhaps someone in your professional sphere, because our mentoring program goes up to 26. And our mentor network, and I truly believe it's because it's women in national security, so they're already so purpose driven. They go above and beyond. I mean, we've had mentor success stories of mentors doing everything from helping draft resumes and CVs and cover letters to helping secure internships at DoD, DOE, Yahoo, Google, across the industries. In addition to, just as you noted, building sustainable relationships, many of our mentor-mentee relationships extend well beyond the mentoring, the kind of formal mentoring program. And then again, a lot of mentees become mentors, which is kind of what we measure success by, is how does that what are those secondary impacts of mentoring? And I can speak for myself that the impact that my mentor had on me was totally transformative. Both from a personal understanding, kind of intergenerational sharing perspective, but also building self-confidence, exposing me to areas of subject areas that I would never have considered, introducing me to people within his or network. And so I think there's many, many benefits to mentoring. There's also lots of data that supports how vital mentoring is, specifically around DEI efforts. And it's even more vital, I think, for young people who, again, may not be getting what they need out of their educational institute, where a mentor can provide some of what they call like wraparound services. So some of those supportive services that they might not be able to get in their school or community.
So how does one join your program as either a mentor or a mentee?
Yeah, so they go to girlsecurity.org and right on the header, it's be mentored, be a mentor, and you sign, fill out some paperwork and sign up, and it's very rewarding.
And is it virtual or is it in person?
We run an e-mentoring program, but certainly folks meet offline sometimes, and that's always great too, because again, they can invite them to their their special luncheons, or we've had mentors take folks to the White House and do tours and all kinds of things like that. So, but our program is virtual, which again, prior to the pandemic, that might have been a novelty, but it just enables us to reach so many more people with our program.
But I would think an e-mentoring relationship might be a little bit safer.
Well, it is from a liability perspective. If I put on my law school cap, it definitely is from that perspective. And but it does allow for ease of communication as well.
We've only got about 8 minutes before we go to the audience. And I wanted to ask you to kind of look into your crystal balls. Admiral, you've said that over the last 25 years, women certainly have made a great deal of progress in the military. How much more do you anticipate in 5 years or 10 years? Do you see a day when there actually will be parity with men in either the civilian or the military side of the Pentagon?
Well, in terms of opportunity, I guess it depends on what you mean by parity. Can women achieve the greatest heights? Can they be the chief of the service or, a chairman? The woman, once we started reaching 4-star rank, that's going to happen. And then it's just going to depend on that person's skill sets. And trust me, the fact we already have our now second woman combatant commander is pretty significant. So eventually we're going to have a woman chief of the service and a woman vice chief and a woman chair. So that's going along. We got to remember though, some of these communities just opened recently and it takes a long time to grow a leader. So for the case of the Navy, submarine community opened only within the last decade. Takes about 22 years to grow a submarine commander. So in another decade, people are going to go, what? First woman submarine commander? Well, yeah, because we only opened up the community, so many years ago. And then you look at the small cadre in the Army, the women who've been, who are now got their Ranger tab. They now have if they choose to stay in, they have the potential to grow up to be the head of a major, special forces unit or one of the major infantry divisions. So it's going to keep happening, and people are going to keep getting surprised when it's the first, but it just takes a while for people to get the experience sets. If you mean parity in terms of ratio, we're still an all volunteer force, and then it gets down to women's propensity to want to go into the military. The services slowly have seen increases, and so we're around 20% women. I think the Air Force is a little bit higher at 25%. But then it's a matter of, is this what women want to do for a living? Do you want to be in construction? Do you want to be a firefighter? And it's less about there's not successful models. It's really about, is that how I want to live my life? And I would say in terms of having to make choices, when you look at where the militaries have come in terms of support to family, childcare, sabbaticals, all of that, all those are in place. Even in terms of maternity leave, strangely, the services are actually a little bit, if not sometimes significantly ahead of where some of our civilian counterparts are. It's quite fascinating. On the civilian side, it's once again, it's what Lauren's trying to do. It's trying to create exposure so that women go, oh my gosh, I can go work in national security. I can be in defense. There have been successful women leaders. And that is, I think on the civilian side, and then in State Department and defense, that is an area where easily we could get to gender parity in terms of at least half the employees and half the leadership reflects that half of our world, women.
Majority.
Yeah, you're looking at this younger generation. When do you see parity, or do you?
I don't, So we use the word equity in our work because certainly, representation is key, but I think we also talk about, the evidence is in the policies, right? Where you have, as I've noted, immigration policies, and there's data on this that, uniquely impacts young people who end up not attending school for fear around their parental security. Or issues around technology where we already see this embedded data bias and AI that's, discriminating against particular communities. The digital domain is starting to look a lot like our physical world where women and girls' security is compromised and there's very little, and again, the burden is shifted on them. So I think for us, it is the representation piece and more experiences and insights being represented at the decision-making tables, but it's also the policy outcomes, right? When we start to see policies that reflect the mindfulness around those experiences, I think we'll know it when we see it, and I think it'll yield better policies. And so I think that's kind of where, at least for girls' security, where we're putting our arrow.
Great, thank you so much. I can't believe we've been talking for more than an hour. Susan, it's now the time to look for questions from the audience. And I see the first question in the chat. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So, lots of questions, so I don't have to squint so much. Can you say a bit about the role of women in negotiating peace agreements? The evidence indicates that settlements and are more robust when women are involved. Susan, do you want to you've had firsthand experience with this. Do you want to?
Yeah, and I think I know the person who asked the question. And
Bonnie Weir, yes.
Bonnie Weir, and she and I have both been involved, very intimately involved in Northern Ireland. And I think one of the things that back at the time around the Good Friday Agreement and, in the 1990s, it was really women who made the difference, in my opinion, or really significantly contributed to the peace process, because there were a group of women from both sides of the divide who formed a group called the Women's Coalition. And a lot of what they had decided was, okay, what do we have in common? What is it that we can agree on? Because our male counterparts, and these are comments that I heard from the actual women involved, our male counterparts can't seem to agree on anything. Are there any things that we can agree on? And one of the things that they did say was, and I think it's the things that both of you have mentioned, is that we want safety so that we can walk on the streets, but we want our children to be able to go to school safely. And we want to be able to stop violence, in the streets. So I think, in my opinion, that may be, and certainly Bonnie can dispute me, but she's a good colleague and friend who teaches at Yale University. I think this may be where she's coming from, is that that's just one example of a conflict that I think women played a huge role in steering the process in the right direction. And an interesting thing is that now with Brexit and things going on in Northern Ireland, someone told me recently that women have become less involved in, maintaining the peace. And that's sort of an interesting phenomenon that surprised me.
The question goes on and asks if there should be quotas as a solution for peace negotiations. Admiral, you've been in these rooms. Do you think that mandating a certain percentage of women at the table would lead to a better outcome?
No, because you got to have the right people at the table. So gender is one lens, but you've got to have folks who want to be at the table, or if not want wooed. But along those lines, I think not so much quotas, but we may be, Susan just jogged my memory. It's these grassroots efforts that you see spring up. I mean, I love the movie Pray the Devil Back to Hell, right? That the women get together and say, no, we're done. We're going to make sure we get to peace. Well, we have opportunities there where we can possibly, as nations, go in and say, hey, let's help these women continue their grassroots effort, not take it over, but help facilitate what they're trying to achieve. And so then, you know, if they can't get help from their own governments, there's opportunities for us to say, you ought to listen to this grassroots effort, or we're going to help you become more successful.
Thank you. Lauren, well, Susan, this is your question. Do you want to ask Lauren directly about
Sure, I'd be
collaboration?
happy to ask it. You know, I was thinking about, because for those of you who don't know, you know, I had a long diplomatic career at the State Department, and I was wondering, because you mentioned about mentoring and collaborating, do you have any plans, or have you thought about perhaps starting to collaborate with either the Defense Department or the State Department to help, you know, young women maybe get a little glimpse into what goes on in the civilian jobs there? Because I think that would be extremely, it'd be a great thing if you could work on that. And then just, I can follow on with that, is that you also mentioned, you know, that you work a lot, especially with high school age students. And I know that state has quite good programs where they try to attract, you know, minorities from colleges and universities, but I don't think they have many programs that are involved in looking at high school students. And I think that you both have kind of highlighted today that, you know, getting people into universities and getting them to think about what they want to do is probably, you know, an extremely important first step.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a great we don't have a formal partnership with State Department, but we have I think 50 to 100 mentors from State Department, so who signed up as a group. You know, they kind of committed to this effort. Differently with DoD, we've had more of a discussion with DoD around making girls part of this conversation around how do you increase representation in national security. And it's a funny thing because we're using the word girl, which implies, you know, childlike, but we're talking about, you know, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are also thinking about the military. I mean, this is the time where they're going into ROTC, or we work with the Naval Sea Cadets. So, so just making that a more comfortable conversation around kind of what that engagement looks like. And I think, to your point, you know, there are some successful State Department programs, but I do think there can be more. And I think it's just a matter of trying to understand kind of the needs of students and what types of opportunities they're looking for, and creating some type of bridge programs, which essentially they do at the freshman and undergraduate level. So yes, we absolutely have those relationships. And then in addition, we have folks from state or DoD who serve as instructors for our sessions. So we have our fellowship, as I mentioned, and folks will come and run sessions on, you know, a day in the life of, or, you know, they'll do a half-hour fireside chat so that people can ask questions about what does this career look like. And those are super successful. To the Admiral's point, is just exposure. Once they just see someone who looks like them talking about a thing that they think is cool, that's enough to at least get them engaged. And then it's just a matter of, you know, making sure there's some supports along the way as well.
Susan, your question goes on and wonders if there's interest in government service today. Is there less interest than there might have been 10 to 20 years ago? Can you gauge that, Lauren?
I actually think there was a recent survey, and I'll have to find it, and it's somewhere in my aging brain, but I think they just did a survey of young people, and it may have been part of the National Commission's work on public and civil service. I can only speak from the lens of the work that we do. So we're obviously attracting girls and women who are interested in service, but we've seen our mentor, you know, the first year of the program, we had 25 mentors. We'll reach 800 in 4 years. So in my mind, that sends a really strong signal that lots of folks are interested in service, just perhaps don't have the support that they need to get from point A to point B, which is why I do think some of the conversation that's playing out in the public that's politicizing all of this can be so dangerous, because, you know, as we often say, it's like there could not be a more common purpose than national security. It belongs to everyone. Therefore, there's a place for everyone. And I hope that we can preserve that conversation, because I do think young people are watching. I do think they're taking stock of what adults are saying. I do think it can have a disincentivizing impact. But we're just not seeing that. I think the one of the other conversations is the private sector in national security can offer more competitive salaries. So you may see people going into a private cybersecurity company or a private contractor where they might be making 2 or 3 times what they might make in an entry-level government position. That's going to be something that's challenging as the standard of living keeps going up.
Admiral, do you have any insights into military recruitment? Are young people more interested in volunteering for the different services?
Well, the propensity has, for at least for the Navy, has held pretty steady. Our real challenge is when we start working our way through eligibility in terms of physical fitness, just having a high school diploma, that pool gets pretty small pretty quickly. And then the services are all competing from that same small pool. And so the desire to serve and the opportunity to serve has stayed the same. The characteristics of the next generation have changed enough. And so, for me, just getting more folks through high school and that economic piece where they're more challenged, getting more of those folks to be able to graduate high school. So they've got that, that's really one of the biggest tickets the services look at in terms of whether or not we want to have you in the service. And why is that important? Because we found there's this strong correlation between being able to finish high school in your teenage years and then being able to complete a commitment, just a 4-year commitment to the service. And so if they can make it through high school, they have the grit to do that, some of them under very challenging conditions, then they have the grit to come into the service. And then once they're in, I can say particularly for the Navy, our retention rates are in the last 20 years have been really high. People come in and they spend 4 years and they go, I like this and I want to do more of it. And that coupled with the fact, there is the GI Bill is fantastic, but we also have education opportunities for folks while they're in. So you can continue to go on to get a bachelor's and master's. And we've had some sailors get doctorates while they're still serving.
I had some exposure for 10 years. I served on the board of a charter school network that's national, but I was part of the New York City grouping. And I learned that the service academies don't necessarily get candidates from every single congressional office. Particularly in inner cities. Has there been, and it's been a decade since I had exposure to this information, has there been greater outreach, do you think, in inner cities to the opportunities for these incredible free educations at the service academies?
Well, I know when I was with the Secretary of the Navy that the Naval Academy started looking at it. So literally what the Naval Academy did is they started an outreach program to freshmen, congressmen, new senators to make sure they were aware of these opportunities and their ability to nominate candidates. And then, and so we forget, Congress turns over just the way corporations sometimes turn over. And so you have to make them aware, if you want to see more people of color in the military at the senior ranks, you have an opportunity and a candidate pool where you can be nominating great students, future great leaders. But if you don't nominate anyone, then you're starting with zero. And so I think once that outreach, so far, at least I can say for the Naval Academy, that was pretty successful. And it's just a matter of maintaining it as our future political leaders take up office.
And Lauren, is the opportunity for a service academy education in your toolkit as well, part of your messaging?
It is. Specifically for girls who are already interested in those pathways, we work to try to elevate the opportunities as they come across our desk to say, hey, there's an opening, they're looking for people, and trying to make that more visible for them so that they understand that those opportunities are available. And also just understanding how the process works, which oftentimes they don't understand how the process works. So again, it's kind of, not to be cliche, but knowledge is power. And especially for young people who are already on that purpose-driven path, they really take to that information and make a point of charting their path sooner once they know how it works.
Susan, I think we're at time.
No,
This has
I think
been
we
a
are.
fabulous conversation. So thank you, Admiral Howard. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Susan, for inviting me to participate again. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that our audience did too. You picked
Well, and
great.
I want to thank you. Yeah, after having been a woman in foreign policy, I really learned a lot today too. So I want to thank all of you, Jackie, but especially Admiral Howard and Lauren. I know now, I mean, I knew why we chose you to be our honorees, but I definitely know now why we made the right choice in picking two such distinguished persons to represent what I think is the best of American foreign policy and national security. So, and I want to thank all of our participants, because if you're watching today, that means you're a strong supporter of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. As you know, next week, not next week, excuse me, but on November 10th, we'll have our formal awards ceremony. And then on November 12th, we'll have another discussion similar to this with Sean Kelly, who will talk about how business and economic decisions influence foreign policy. And I'm certainly sure he'll be able to talk about how developing economic opportunities for underserved communities, especially in Northern Ireland, has really made a difference in conflict resolution. So thanks again to all of you. And I look forward to seeing you on November 10th.